Region Europe is the international program of the University of Turin, pursuing a comprehensive knowledge of the European model of regional integration and of the EU as a global actor. The involvement of 45 guest lecturers coming from all across the world's most prestigious universities and institutions allows us to bring fresh and critical perspectives on crucial issues concerning European integration and the role of the EU in world affairs, with a forward-looking approach. We want to introduce you to how the EU actually works from its beating heart, visiting its institutions and interacting with its actors. From its first edition, each year Region Europe has given the opportunity to more than 150 students coming from all over the world to gather and exchange views and experiences.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I really appreciate the opportunity to be back with you, even under changed circumstances. I hope all your students can hear me quite clearly. I've got quite a loud, booming voice, so I trust that they will be able to hear me.
Yes.
I will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I hope I will be able to retain your students' attention. By virtue of a topic that I find, quite interesting and have been a student of for quite a little while. But there are essentially three registers that I want to speak to in terms of the lecture topic. The one concerns the EU-China connection. The other concerns the EU-Africa connection. And then the third concerns the China-Africa connection. And there are frameworks that speak to each of those. However, let me try and set the stage. What is really interesting is the level of continuity in these three platforms. Since around the time that they started the engagements, so the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, otherwise known as FOCAC, FOCAC, was established in 2000. That is the institutional platform for managing the Africa-China connection. And then there is the European-China Strategic Partnership, which was established in 2003. So it is 17 years old this year. And then thirdly, there is what's called the Joint EU-Africa Strategic Partnership. And that was established in 2007 at Lisbon. And there have been 5 summits, the last one being in 2017 in Abidjan. There was supposed to be one last month, joint EU-Africa summit in 2020, but that has been postponed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, let me just set the stage, if I will, by making some preliminary comments. That is the nature of the liberal international order, students, that we now currently find ourselves. And I want to advance an argument that the foundations of the liberal international order are coming in under increasing threat and pressure amidst a variety of centrifugal forces. Now, what are those centrifugal forces? Allied to those centrifugal forces are the problem of global norms, which are being eroded, multilateral institutions which are being further weakened. And we've seen, the weakening of institutions and the erosion of global norms, particularly under this current president in the United States, Donald Trump. There are some indicators. The global viral storm unleashed by COVID-19. There are rising military tensions. There are disruptive trade and commercial relations. Environmental degradation is with us, as is climate change. We experience the deleterious effects of climate change across countries and regions with greater intensity. There is an abuse of cyber sources of hard and soft power. We're experiencing globally, I think, forms of atavistic bigotry and racism. And finally, there are intractable proxy conflicts. As I tell my students, the current context is characterized by what I call a VUCA world. You can write this down, VUCA. So what does that mean? V for volatile, U for uncertain, C for complex, A for ambiguous. So those indicators that I gave you are indicative of this VUCA world. Now let me come against that background to speak to some of the issues that I want to talk about. Now, since the establishment of the EU-China strategic partnership, it has by two dimensions. One is commercial imperatives, and the other is European Union ambitions, soft balance, as it were, a unipolar, multipolar universe as a consequence of the end of the Cold War. And against those two dimensions, there's also been an attempt to leverage cooperation with China in two broad overlapping phases. First is the broad. The EU has initiated a range of bilateral, multilateral, and most prominently attempts, right? I say attempts, trilateral forms of engagement. Then the trilateral forms of engagement is that sort of triangular dynamic between the European Union, Africa, and China, sort of an interactive loop, if you like. And that has really characterized the debates about China, Africa, and EU-Africa cooperation in the context of EU aspirations. And I want to make this point, and importantly, because it's an important subtext of my lecture. The tensions between the European Union and China vis-a-vis Africa really arise from the EU aspirations to socialize China norms that underpin Western aid, trade, and development cooperation frameworks, right? That is my essential argument that I hope to provoke you with when it comes to Q&A. But here is the consequence of this. If you do a broad audit of all these initiatives, 2003, the EU partnership, 2007, the EU Lisbon Summit, and then I'll come to the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. There's very little to show. There's very little to show in terms of actual instrumental and welfare gains that flow from these initiatives because of three essential reasons. The first is internal tensions within EU decision-making structures and among EU members, right? There are very different kind of dispositions and outlooks, philosophical, instrumental, normative, among the 28 EU member states concerning the essential framework of development cooperation, although on the side of trade that might differ. There is also a very nuanced way, there is Africans trilateral cooperation, because it seems to African countries that they are the proverbial, since you are in Italy, they are the salami in the sandwich, Giovanni. Africa is sort of caught in the middle. Even this side, China on the other side, and then Africa and the continent squashed in the middle. Then there's the third dimension, which deals with China's unwillingness to surrender, the autonomy that it has built up and the strategic advantage that it has built up over the last 20 years in expanding its trade development and cooperation blueprint in Africa. The second dimension deals with Africa's own economic and structural transformation, right? This is very important because it goes to the heart of Africa trying to develop its own agency, from dependency, trying to act on its own terms, of the structural transformation of its institutions, its norms, and its organizations. Most fundamentally, class is the development of a 50-year blueprint called Agenda 2063. You might have heard about Agenda 2063. It essentially maps how the continent can transform itself in structural terms, both internally and in its external engagements, away from this sort of dependent relationship, away from being stigmatized as a commoditized periphery, only exporting, primary goods, to a continent that could be a player in both in terms of its participation in global value chains, as well as a serious player within the circuits of the multilateral system. Then, allied to the Continental Free Trade Agreement is the development of a new template, very important, and this, I think, is inspiration quite fundamentally from the European Union experience, and this is the establishment of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. This agreement locks 5 countries. This is a legally binding agreement adopted at Kigali, Rwanda last year, and now almost 30 countries have ratified its instruments. It was supposed to become operational on the 1st of July this year, but thanks to COVID, the implementation has now been postponed. Very crucially, a secretariat, a dedicated secretariat, very similar to what we have in Europe, trade, has been put in place in Accra, the Continental Free Trade Agreement Secretariat. So there's been a significant change, both in the substance, the dynamics, and the broad political strategic orientation of African countries at the continental level, away from sort of the precepts of the original Organization of African Unity, which was an attempt to defend the sovereignty of African countries undergoing independence, to the adoption of the Constitutive Act of 2003, which basically established new norms and standards for African countries to pursue with regard to very important principles, whether in democracy, human rights, the rule of law, integration, etc., etc. Quite crucially, under the democracy umbrella, there are certain empowerment norms, particularly with regard to gender, etc., etc. So, what to say about China-EU cooperation and Africa development? Let's look at that as my first dimension. So, first thing to note is interactive role that Africa plays in contemporary relations between China and the European Union. This has much to do with the legacy of Europe's structural dominance of the African economic space, since the Berlin Conference in 1884, 1885, powers sort of carved up the continent in terms of their own spheres of interest. So it goes back to the colonial period, continuing into the post-independence era, where Europe has been a really dominant and formative player in the evolution of the African continent's politics and its economic development. So, observers in Europe, since about 2000, the rise of China as an increasingly prominent economic partner in Africa has been viewed with a great sense of ambivalence. China is at once viewed as an economic rival. It is viewed as a potential partner, and it is also viewed, as a rising power that could possibly, rather than a rule taker, also become a rule maker in the multilateral system, become a much more responsible global citizen with China's, with Europe, of finding greater alignment and synergy in development policy, its commercial interests, as well as the European Union's normative concerns and its normative agenda. And all of this, of course, raises some first-order questions about what is the role of the European Union as a global player in the post-Cold War context. we accept fundamental thesis, position, that in the post-Cold War world, the balance of power and the calculus of power has changed quite fundamentally. And I think there's a general consensus that the power balance is sort of unipolar, with the United States being sort of the unipolar axis, and it's multipolar, distinctly multipolar, with a range of other powers that occupy different regional and multilateral spaces, with the European Union probably being number one, no, call it that, but it's also a very important player in trade and development. Right? But I think that European Union is still undergoing a sort of identity crisis. I don't know if I put that to you as a question. I mean, the Eurozone crisis, the problem of migration and immigration, the rise of protectionism, sort of neo-mercantilist impulses within the European Union, Brexit, etc., etc. It has changed the character of the pan-European experiment. I think there are pockets of parochial nationalism in European that sort of undermine the broad European idea. Then we come to, what about China? How should we try and understand China's role, particularly in Africa? And I think there are three interesting perspectives here to the class. And now, let me just sort of enumerate what those perspectives are. First, looks at China as a development partner, right? Committed to sort of a win-win formula, pursuing mutual gains through trade investment and development assistance, all of which, across the board, wherever China has deep engagements, result in new prospects for growth and development. That's the first perspective. And then the second perspective looks at China as an economic competitor. Its national interest in the case of Africa concentrated in the extraction of Africa's abundant resources, the exploitation thereof, as a means of underwriting China's own modernization, at least until the 2008 financial crisis. China fundamentally recalibrated its economy away from exports, more towards domestic consumption, diversification, particularly concentrating on new forms of production, drawing on the essential ethos of the fourth industrial revolution. China is not concerned about Western and European normative concerns relating to good governance, human rights, environmental protection, labor standards, and so on. And in the third, point of view, China is embodiment of a new scramble for Africa. China has sort of neo-colonial ambitions, behaving no different from the other colonial powers, major powers, such as the European Union and its United States. But the core of this third dimension, this third prism, is China's ambition to displace traditional Western spheres of influence in Africa within the context of South-South cooperation. So those are essential premises.
Yeah, sorry, Garth. Sorry, Garth. The students are asking if you can repeat the first perspectives about China. That is a development actor.
They didn't hear me.
Yeah, now we can, but maybe
the first perspective, which views. Am I going too fast for your class? Am I going too fast?
No. The problem is the connection. No, it's not.
Am I breaking up? Yeah. All right. So the first perspective class, it views Africa and other developing countries, sees itself as a development partner, right? Committed to a win-win of mutual gains. So the gain for China is also a gain for its development partners, whether in Africa or in other developing countries. The mutual gains come through trade, it comes through investment, and it comes through development assistance, all of which come together to enhancing the growth and the prospects of African and developed countries. Right. So that is the logic. Did you get that?
Yeah. But the students are asking if you could slow down a bit because of the connection. You see, because yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. No, but don't worry. But it's a problem it's a connection problem. So yeah.
Okay. Now I have to come back to my train of thought. So the class then, the signing of the China Comprehensive Agreement in 2003. So this is the agreement that forms the foundation in terms of principles, strategies, policies, and practices. Right? Essentially, it is a formal institutional and legal framework for dialogue and cooperation. And there have been annual meetings since then. So essentially, I think the last meeting was 2018 between the Chinese and the European side. That really looks at how the two sides, can enter a dialogue that will promote greater convergence and cooperation across a number of areas of mutual interest. So the areas that have received the most attention in this partnership agreement between China and the European Union have been primarily economic and commercial in content, and that trend has been expanded quite fundamentally through the joint declarations and initiatives over the years. Now, initially, while Africa was not expected to be a focus in the dialogue, it quickly assumed a very important topical area of focus, a very important arena of action for China EU relations. Given the strategic relationship between China and Africa, I'll come to that presently. We know that historically, as I said, there's been a strong involvement of European countries, and then subsequently through the trade agreements of the Lomé Convention, which essentially, define the trade and cooperation nexus between Europe and Africa. And then that was changed, as you would know. The Lomé Convention was superseded by the Continental Agreement, primarily because the European Union wanted or wished to conform to WTO, World Trade Organization, benchmarks for free trade agreements. Embedded within the Lomé Convention were certain preferences, and those preferences were seen as anathema. Article 23 of the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which governs regional trade agreements. So the challenge for the European Union, as with African countries, was to craft a new framework for trade to conform to WTO principles, even though this trade agreement, called the Economic Partnership Agreements, would be asymmetric in timing and content. In other words, in countries, in terms of market access and trade liberalization, would be expected to open their economies at a slower rate than that of the European Union. So that is the Africa kind of dimension. As operationalized, the efforts to institutionalize the EU-China-Africa Development Cooperation Framework tend to be characterized by sort of two essential features or characteristics. The first was bilateral EU-China engagement. So bilateral China-EU engagement, right? led by the European Commission. And the second was the multilateral dimension, multilateral cooperation, which was focused on aspects of African development, and then the triangular EU, China, Africa complex, mediated through established multilateral organizations and channels. So that took account, for example, of United Nations framework on peace and security, WTO agreements, emerging international social compacts on population, on climate change, on poverty, the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. All those were then integrated as part of the trilateral discourse. So what were the basic nodes of cooperation that kept European policymakers engaged in the various cooperation initiatives with China? So the structured dialogue essentially focused on the one hand, conforming to OECD Development Assistance Committee requirements for development assistance, right? So how could China and the Union bring their development assistance into alignment? And those bilateral initiatives were quite problematic in the sense that while, in terms of the DAC principles, ownership was important, Africans felt that they didn't feature anywhere in the ownership framework. That whatever development assistance initiatives were possibly mounted by China and the European Union, insofar as they conformed to principles, the voice of Africa was totally absent. So that was a serious problem. Where is the voice in this bilateral dialogue? Well, at the multilateral level, registers, right? Bilateral, multilateral. Yeah, there was, I think, a context try and find common cause around normative standards. Equally problematic for China and problematic for Africa. And remember, the European Union as a normative power is also what we could call a norm entrepreneur. It promotes forms of normative entrepreneurship, the promotion of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, etc., etc. Those things were quite problematic for China as it was for the European Union. This led obviously to tensions because the discourse and the conversation and the dialogue was not a smooth one. From one platform to the next, it was essentially a carryover of these tensions with clear evidence that African countries and the voice of Africa was becoming increasingly concerned about the extent to which, the contradictory consequences of EU-China dialogue was not redounding to the benefit of African countries. And this is where I think there was a serious effort, especially on the part of the European Union, to mount this kind of trilateral cooperation and, promote a sort of triangular ethos. And of course, there's always the instrumental transactional dynamic in EU-Africa relations, in the sense that this has always been asymmetric, historically asymmetric, where Africa-EU relations were characterized by a donor-recipient relationship. And that has characterized European-led development over the last 20 years. So, the ethos of South-South cooperation, which is very strongly embedded in the international relations of both Africa and continental institutions, as well as the African Union, was seen as a oppositional, the one that was promoted by the European Union. The European Union, while it paid sort of rhetorical lip service to North-South dialogue, and if you look at the characterizations of the EU-China framework, the EU-Africa framework, it is really embedded in the broad philosophical ethos of promoting strong North-South dialogue and trying to bridge the gap between North and the South. Now, let me leave that and come to the African Union, Africa's partnerships with the European Union on the one hand, and with China on the other. So I have told you about the joint Africa-EU strategy, which was adopted in Lisbon, 2007. And the two sides meet every 3 years. So the last meeting took place in Abidjan, in the Ivory Coast, and there are action plans that grow from each of those meetings. So based on wherever the meeting is held, it will be called, it will be named, the action plan will be named after the location where the meeting is held. So, for example, there's a meeting in Tripoli in 2010, there's a Tripoli action plan. There was a meeting in Brussels 2014, there was a Brussels action plan. There was a meeting in 2017, which was the last one, and that was the Abidjan action plan. So it's you know, after each summit, there's an attempt to review the previous action plans, coming with new ones, synthesize where possible, and then that becomes the framework for framing the interregnum, as it were, between the summits of the African Union and the European Union. Now, quite interestingly, at the level of the continent, Africa is represented by the African Union. So the African Union is the primary representative of African interests, as is the European Union of the 28. It's those two as the actors representing the respective voices. What is important to know here is that the strategic partnership between the African Union and Europe is seen as much more than an overtly political relationship. It is really, you know, seen in terms of a strategic partnership of equals. That strategic partnership of equals is meant to take account of respective interests of the African continent vis-a-vis Europe, and Europe's interests vis-a-vis those of the continent in light of fundamental geopolitical shifts, the primary one of which for both sides is China's growing presence and influence in Africa. Let me just jump to some of the areas around which there has been cooperation that has been substantive between the European Union and the African Union. The one that is always held up as representing significant progress is on peace and security. On peace and security, great progress, especially in EU support for what is called APSA, APSA, the African Peace and Security Architecture, where through the African Peace Facility, the European Union is one of the major donors. Meaning, compared to other donors, the European Union provides almost 80% of the funding of the African Peace Facility, which is essentially meant to assist with international peacekeeping, but also to help the African Union's institutions, primarily its own Peace and Security Council, with security operations and capacity building. Now, the peace facility is very important because it really represents a joint solution, a joint initiative or endeavor, finding solutions to Africa's peace and security issues. And important thing to note here is that since the end of the Cold War, most of the peace and security challenges in Africa are intrastate. They arise within countries. They are not interstate. There has been a significant decline in interstate warfare and interstate conflict. So most of the, for those of you sort of follow what is happening in the continent within security, peace and security issues, will note, that the tensions and the conflicts arise within countries, whether it be in Mali, whether it be in the Central African Republic, whether it be sort of the problem across countries that are threatened by Islamic fundamentalism, etc., etc. It's really dealing with threats to African countries' sovereignty and helping to maintain their territorial integrity. Let me jump now to the African Union and China. The African Union and China. I think I might have left something out. No, it's fine. Let me jump to the African Union and China and the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. So FOCAC is the acronym. FOCAC, which was established in Beijing in 2000 by Hu Jintao. This is the institutional platform for managing relations between China and African countries. The interesting thing to note here is whereas at the EU continental level, at the EU Africa level, African countries are represented by the African Union. In FOCAC, it is a bilateral mechanism. African countries participate bilaterally. So all the countries that have official relations with China are part of the FOCAC platform. There are only 4 at last count. There are only 4 countries that still maintain relations with Taiwan. So in essence, there are 51 countries that that participate within the FOCAC platform. And FOCAC meets at summit level every 3 years. Right? So it alternates between China, typically Beijing, and then an African country that is willing to host it. For example, in 2015, the FOCAC summit was held in South Africa. Interesting thing to note about the FOCAC process is the kind of commitments, asymmetric as they are, that China makes at these meetings. Just to give you some examples, right? If you look at the Beijing meeting in 2012, right, China announced provisions for $20 billion in loans for infrastructure and further expansion of agricultural cooperation. Very importantly, through the FOCAC process, China committed $200 million to build the new African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa as a token of Chinese friendship and sincerity. If you look at the FOCAC summits in South Africa 2015 and then the one in Beijing in 2018, in each of those there were $60 billion packages that were made available for financing 10 major initiatives. And those initiatives include building industrial capacity, investment in manufacturing, high-tech agriculture, energy, infrastructure, building African capacities to facilitate trade between African countries and China. And very importantly, at the 2018 summit, which was again held in Beijing, strong commitments were made and improve industrial capacity of African countries, primarily driven by a policy change on the part of China, which was to externalize 60 million manufacturing jobs to what Chinese called external geographies. Because of the recalibration of its economy away from exports to domestic consumption, China is now looking for external partners, and because of the strategic place of African countries in China's foreign relations, it is expected that the bulk of those 60 million jobs can be located in African countries because of two reasons. The one is the abundance of labor, and the other is the ability of African countries to sort of leapfrog, phases of industrialization to building sort of low entry manufacturing capacity, which will not only be good for the African Union and the African Union's integration agenda as far as the Continental Free Trade Agreement is concerned, it will also give African countries and African economies the ability to compete in global value chains. Remember that historically, African countries come in at the lower end of global value chains as exporters of commodities and basic resources. So the idea here is that investment by China and relocating these manufacturing jobs in African countries in the first instance, and in the second instance, along the Belt and Road Initiative. I presume you've heard about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is really a major integration experiment across land and maritime areas to expand, China's global footprint in a range of activities where Africa will feature quite prominently. The FOCAC process has been quite instrumental in engaging African countries in that kind of dialogue, but quite crucially on the basis of what is called the One China policy. It's very important to understand this class. Contrary to the European Union's, edict of adhering norms and building norms into conditionalities, by the way, as a condition for participating in EU trade and development frameworks, China does not have that. So the basis of engagement in China is set extremely low on the basis of non-interference and the other principles that sort of frame China's engagement with European countries: mutual respect, sincerity, friendship, etc., etc. So there is a fundamental difference, gulf, a chasm, if you will, between China's trade development cooperation in Africa and that of the European Union on the basis of these very important fundamental philosophical principles that frame their cooperation agendas. And China has not been successful, must say, in socializing China into its own sort of framework. The European Union, the EU, the EU has raised its voice, for example, about the violation of human rights in China. There have been protests within the European Parliament about China's egregious violations of human rights, whether it is putting opposition voices in jail, or whether it is undermining, the rights of people in Xinjiang that has a majority of Muslim population in China and putting them in prison camps, etc., etc. China finds that extremely intrusive. So the interesting thing vis-a-vis China and Africa is the shift in China's discourse as a consequence of this dialogue with FOCAC, where China is now, the new focus is not a new focus per se, but it is an emphasis on security and regional governance issues that are important underpinnings of China's interests and relations with African countries. The important thing to note is the instrumental nature of those concerns. They are not normative. China's focus on security and regional governance is all about protecting the growing number of the Chinese businesses. There are over 1,000 of those spread across the African continent. There's a growing number of African citizens spread across African countries. I think the conservative estimate is something like 3 to 3.5 million. Then a growing raft of investments. So, the criticism, of course, is that China, preaches a rhetoric of solidarity and so on. But to the European Union, by the way, the EU remains China's largest trading partner as a bloc. So the European Union accounts for something like 28% of African exports, but that has declined fundamentally since 2000, from about 38%, so about a 10% decline. Whereas if you look at China, there's been a fundamental increase, a rapid and exponential increase in China's volume of trade with the African continent, so much so that two-way trade has grown from about a low of 4% in 2000 to about 17%. So China, in essence, is the continent's largest trading partner on a country-to-country basis. For the criticism, and it goes back to those three perspectives that I told you about, is that China's relationship with Africa depends on raw material exports, little value added, little attempt, to build manufacturing and industry. Labor relations are strained because China does not conform to local labor and environmental standards. We have seen the example of the Chinese. There were serious accidents in these mines that were purchased by Chinese companies because they did not observe labor standards, serious industrial accident. And so, the broad criticism is that China is guilty of serious violations of environmental, labor, and immigration laws. Let me now just jump to elements of trilateral cooperation, and then I will try and conclude. What can one say about the dynamics of trilateral cooperation? China's increasing active engagement in peace and security efforts. So these are an outgrowth of policy initiatives that were developed at the multilateral level of Africa relations, and which were then institutionalized, right, as I said, at the fifth meeting. Now, within the European Union and EU foreign policy circles, it is increasingly asserted that China's new focus on security and regional governance, as I said, is rather driven by these instrumental interests. has very little to do with promoting norms and standards of good governance, etc., etc. What is important is that outside the European Union, the United Kingdom, Britain, and France have established their own initiatives of bilateral dialogue with China on Africa. Although Germany has not established such a policy, specifically to engage with China on Africa, German policymakers regularly conduct exchanges with the Chinese counterparts on development issues in Africa. On the British side, there's DFID, the British Department of International Development, which has been most active in terms of concrete triangular projects, increasingly so in the area of infrastructure development. And for example, in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, DFID, which is this British Department of International Development, they are working with the government and Chinese companies, right? Working with the government and Chinese companies to fund the drafting of social and environmental standards. So China is becoming increasingly sensitive to this criticism, both from the EU side and from the bilateral donors about its behavior in the context of labor environmental standards. So here's a first effort to develop common environmental standards for road projects and to undertake appropriate impact assessments. Yeah, I think I've said enough to sort of lay the context, Giovanni. But let me just try and conclude here with the differences when it comes to trilateral cooperation, some of which are quite significant between European and Chinese approaches to Africa, and that influences both the scope, the areas, and the depth of cooperation. So, as I try to underscore throughout this lecture, they've always emphasized the importance of internal human rights and democracy in Africa. So those conditionalities are streamlined throughout EU development cooperation frameworks. As a matter of fact, they form the bedrock if you study the joint EU strategy. They are the cornerstones of the relationship. For China, it is the external dimension. It is the external dimension that countries should respect diversity. They should respect the autonomy and the independent choices that Africa makes in terms of how they govern themselves and constitutional principles that govern their political systems, but rather it is making for China the multilateral system make work for the community of nations. Less concerned with internal dynamics, but more concerned with the external dimension on the efficacy, the robustness of the international system of multilateral institutions, international organizations. And that has become even a stronger focus, I would argue, since China has become a rising power, especially in its tensions with the United States. The United States retreat into this protectionist cell under Donald Trump. The entire disposition to international trade is essentially neo-mercantilist in its impulse. China has really seen a strategic opening here, become a much more activist global actor. And in becoming a much more activist global actor, China does not see the European Union as a major partner in that exercise, but grounds it in a sort of a new orthodoxy, a new ethos that will be driven by South-South cooperation. And here, if you look at, and this is an interesting thesis topic that you might want to look at, how is South-South cooperation with China as the anchor changing the contours of international relations. It is in quite fundamental ways. China is offering a different paradigm for international trade, a different paradigm for international cooperation that moves away from the sort of realist orthodoxies that have shaped the liberal international order that is now in a very troubled state, as I tried to suggest. Now, the obvious challenge for the three-way partnership is what happens in the post-COVID era. What will happen? I think there is significant space now for building, revitalizing international institutions, international organizations, international compacts, particularly given inclinations in foreign policy that Joe Biden has, which is fundamentally different from Donald Trump, fundamentally different. So it inaugurates sort of a new promise of a different multilateral universe where China will probably, it won't be easy, because I think Joe Biden's inclinations towards China is one of containment. China doesn't want to be contained. It sees itself, as a legitimate global actor, and it will assert itself as such. But I think the post-COVID context provides a new opportunity for international cooperation between the three actors, between the EU and Africa, between the EU and China, and between Africa and the European Union. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thanks, Giovanni.
Thank you, Garth. Thank you very much. I already see a question from Margherita. Margherita, you can take the mic and pose your question to Professor Pere. Okay.
I hope you can hear me clearly. Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I wanted to ask you a question about whether, in your opinion, there is a different African perception about the EU action and relationships between the EU and the African Union and the African continent, and the French relationships with the African continent and Union. Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah. Please.
Let me try. Let me try and answer your question in this way: that despite Africa's pretensions at continental unity, the African continent still tends to be divided in outlook, political outlook, in terms of how they sort of frame their external relations by the colonial experiences. We must understand the logic of colonialism in Africa along two registers. The British colonial logic was driven by what they call indirect rule. So essentially, rule through chiefs. Although there was a presence of a colonial administration, it was essentially, to allow African countries, to allow a British presence in African countries, their colonial territories, that were governed by indirect rule. In contradistinction, the French really emphasized, what they call the French community, la francophonie. It was really an attempt to embed French identity, a strong sense of French identity in African countries, and you still see that as a major cleavage between, the dominant, linguistic as well as regional divides in Africa. France, cut the long story short, remains an intrusive power. It shapes not only financial relations, but it also shapes African countries govern themselves. African countries very much still, conform to a French outlook of the world, a French outlook that sees themselves as perhaps, in terms of culture, much more cosmopolitan, in terms of, how they govern themselves, much more participatory, etc. That is hardly the case, because whenever, Francophone countries find themselves in trouble, they have recourse intervention. And this provides a huge, I think, a huge impediment driving these continental initiatives and to helping the African Union with one voice, whether it be vis-a-vis China, whether it be vis-a-vis the European Union. So it is extremely divisive. And you can even see it within regional economic communities. You know, within West Africa, there's a regional economic community called ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. Embedded within ECOWAS is a community of French-speaking countries that use the French franc, use a monetary currency that is backed by the Central Bank of France. So, you know, this goes to the heart of the kind of economic and fiscal autonomy that countries need to negotiate regional agreements. And this is why there's so much skepticism that, you know, African countries and the Continental the African Union will be able to, over the next 50 years, in the case of Agenda 2063, over the next 10 to 15 years, implement the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The French component and France itself will remain impediments, you know, to these grand ambitions.
Yeah, I believe it's divisive on both sides, both in the African side, but also in the EU, in the sense that you mentioned the identity crisis that the EU is facing. And I believe that France's approach to Africa is one of the divisive elements of the EU at the moment. So it's interesting to see whether there's some kind of divisive approach, divisive correlation between the divisive topic of French action in the EU.
Well, you know
the African Union.
You know, la francophonie is not only, you know, an expression of French identity, of French affinity. It also finds expression as a community, in the sense that annually the French president, whoever that French president is, hosts all French-speaking countries in Paris. So there is a dedicated platform, which many other countries, whether they English-speaking, Portuguese speaking, they frown against, even at the level of the African Union. They find this extremely, as we said, divisive, because it goes back to an old strategy of France, which is to co-opt, the strategy of co-optation of ruling elites from French African countries and bringing them into a form of dependence on France. And as I say, you see this in the 8 countries of the UMO, which is the grouping that use the French franc, backed by the Central Bank of France.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Can I go now?
Sorry?
Am I free to go now?
Free to go? No, there are questions. No, please stay here. Please stay there. And there is a question, or more than one question, by Michael. So, Michael, please take the mic.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, okay, thank you. So it's not every day that we have the opportunity to discuss with an expert like you, Mr. Garth, on such interesting topics. I would even say one of the most interesting on the international scene today, geopolitics and for the future. So thank you for your presentation. I have some questions, and don't be surprised that most of them are really mundane. So you mentioned that the exponential growth increasing in trade between China and Africa. Exactly when we look at the evolution of soft power and the strong presence of China in Africa today, we can say that. Can we say that it is succeeding on doing what Europe has not been able to do for years. I mean, to really contribute to the development of Africa, considering that its presence on the continent is quite recent compared to Europe. So that's my first question.
Michael, thank you very much for your comment. Can I just give you a simple example to make the point, and just answer your question by way of an example? You understand the how malaria works, right? You're from Africa, I presume.
Yeah, yes. I'm from Africa, from Cameroon.
You're from Cameroon. Ah, ça va, bonjour. Michael, that 90% of all deaths from malaria globally occur in Africa, right? And it's the ability of the bacteria that cause the mosquito that causes the bacteria to mutate all the time. So as the bacteria mutates, it becomes more lethal and deadly. However, because malaria is a tropical disease, there's been an element of what we could call pharmaceutical imperialism. Western for the last 20 years have invested very little on combating malaria and finding the kind of medical interventions, the therapeutics that would be able to combat malaria. As a matter of fact, if you look at the World Bank programs that fund malaria, combating malaria over the last 20 to 30 years, those World Bank programs have hardly made a difference because the same drugs are prescribed over and over and over again, right? Because the Western pharmaceutical companies see very little profit in investing in tropical diseases, most of which occur in areas like Africa. Along comes China in 2003. Along comes China in 2003. And through that mechanism I talked about, FOCAC, there is a conversation between Chinese pharmacologists and African scientists, as part of the science and technology platform. There's a science and technology platform that goes with FOCAC. And these Chinese pharmacologists, they said, we've been using a certain ingredient in Chinese medicine. It's called the Artemisia shrub. We've been using this shrub for hundreds and hundreds of years in Chinese medicine. It cures all sorts of things. How about if we do some serious research and development with you on trying to find a prophylaxis for a long story short, in less than 5 years, they produced a drug that is more effective than almost 20 years of World Bank, IMF-funded programs to combat malaria. 2006, Hu Jintao made available $100 million, established 3 plants, distribution plants in West, Central, and East Africa for distributing these drugs. Now, in a space of almost 10 years, the quantum, if you look at WHO figures, the quantum of malaria deaths have come down, especially among women and children. So, this I think is a very interesting example, and there are several others, which is not to say that China's presence in Africa, is as white as the driven snow. There are lots of problematic areas around which we can find a long laundry list of criticism against how China does business. For example, has China promoted skills transfer? One of the big criticisms of China is what is called vertical integration in its big projects, especially infrastructure projects. Vertical integration means that all the major inputs, skills, the management of the project, right down to how they source, basic material for the project, does not necessarily come from Africa. There's very little skills transfer in building local business, building manufacturing capacity, although that has changed, since Xi Jinping. But, the point that you make is that China has filled a trade cooperation and a development cooperation gap which has been left by the retrenchment of the European Union presence in the continent. That is the point. Oh, so did you find the example of the malaria treatment interesting?
Okay. Thank you. I have my last question. So, my last question. So,
yeah, please.
If we analyze the African paradox, we all know that Africa is one of the richest regions in the world, obvious, with almost inexhaustible resources, but it has one of the poorest populations in the world. That is the paradox. So it is caught in the trap of development aid, both by Europe and China. So when we analyze this relationship, should we speak of cooperation, about cooperation or neocolonialism? Thank you.
Good question, Garth.
What did you ask? What was the last part of the question, Michael? Is it neocolonialism or?
Should we speak should we say that this relation is a cooperation or is a neocolonialism?
Look, it's a bit of both, but I must hasten to add, Michael, that there is complicity. There's enough blame to go around. I think we must hold African governments to account here. If you look at the post-colonial record of governance in Africa, what is the record of governance in Africa, Michael? We can talk about the post-colonial state in Africa, and I've got a thesis for you. The post-colonial state in Africa very much derives its functional, strategic, and management logic from the colonial regime. Why do I say so? I say so because after independence, African ruling elites essentially drew the forms of state management, institutional governance from the colonial logic. And what is that colonial logic based on? It's based on the following issues. It's based on accumulation, right? It is based on cooptation. It is based on it is based on essentially using power informally to advance norms of patronage, what is called neo-patrimonialism. The colonial state in Africa is sort of dysfunctional. There is a Nigerian friend of mine who's written a book on this. African state, the post-colonial state of fiction, because it did not evolve naturally, right? So if you capture the state in Africa, you capture society, you capture the wealth. This is why you have this problem of democratization, what Prof. Annan called, the democratic deficit, growing incidence of the reversal towards authoritarian governance, repression in the face of growing levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Now, this is the problem of sovereignty, hard sovereignty, where agreements are made which are supranational in character, in substance. Right? So if you take, for example, Agenda 2063, it requires African member states to make certain commitments. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a very good example because it will require member states, the 30 countries that have now ratified the instruments of the agreement, make significant tariff, non-tariff offers. They have to essentially open their markets, number one. Number two, they have to re-engineer their internal governance institutions, from macroeconomic policy, from interest policy, fiscal policy, to anti-corruption, all these very important things that require participation or membership in the European Union, for example. What is it called, Giovanni? The acquis communautaire, right? So we don't have the equivalent of an acquis communautaire. We have to meet certain benchmarks to participate. We have this free rider problem, and in the process, African countries, if you look at indices, for example, there's one index which is called the Index of State Fragility. The last time I checked, there were 25 countries globally that were considered fragile, according to 12 indices. 21 of those are in Africa. 21 of those are in Africa. If you look at human development indicators, levels of material, African countries perform the worst. In the context of this kind of paradox you talk about. So, I think there has to be a significant change in governance. This is going to take a very, very, very long time. Until African countries are willing to cede a modicum of sovereignty to supranational institutions for the common good, governance is going to be a problem. Until, the European Union lays down very strict rules, on a common identity in Africa, you're going to get this kind of, divisiveness that one of your colleagues talked about, vis-a-vis, French intervention and French inclusiveness in the continent. So it seems to me, that we can only hope. I think my final comment, Michael, is for Africa. This COVID-19 pandemic is two things. It is an apocalypse, right? You know the meaning of apocalypse, disaster. Although the effects are still creeping, it's interesting considering the initial forecast that Africa would be worst affected. It's one of the least affected countries. However, COVID has had a deep impact on African economies. From aggregate of 2.9% before COVID, African economies have now contracted to -5%. So this is apocalyptic in a sense, right? So that's the one thing. But COVID-19 is also an epiphany. Understand the English word epiphany, right? It's a revelation. It's a wake-up call. You can't do business as usual. To mean that there has to be seriousness of purpose with regard to two things: improving institutions for governance, and then taking very seriously, the challenges of integration. Kwame Nkrumah said, "If Africa does not unite, nobody else will unite Africa for us." Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. There is a question from me, which has to do. So far we have talked about relations among governments, right? But what about civil society? Of course, civil society is something extremely heterogeneous. So it is very difficult to think at civil society as something as an actor or as a. But what are the debates in civil society about, for example, China's involvement in Africa and about China as a development actor in comparison to Europe, for example? So what do you think about this?
I mean, the interesting thing, Giovanni, is that if you look at the quality of scholarly work, scholarly research, on the one hand, if you look at media reporting, the critical media reporting, not the kind of CGTN, China Global Television Network. It's got an African bureau. It's all good stories, kind of thing. But there were certain NGOs and think tanks, with the assistance, by the way, of European and American European NGOs, American foundations, that started to look into on these studies. What is China doing in Kenya? What is China doing in Burkina Faso? What is China doing in Morocco? So there are certain case studies that started to highlight certain things. I gave the example of, the copper belt in Zambia was de facto dead because the drop in investments, the consequence of the drop in the global price of copper, until the huge Chinese conglomerates came along and bought some of those assets. The violation of labor environmental standards, those things were highlighted by environmental NGOs in Africa. So there is a voice, and I think those voices have been taken note of. The interesting thing here, Giovanni, is in the FOCAC platform, right, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, it's not only a state-to-state engagement. And here you have to give both the Chinese and the African sides some credit. There's a business council, there's a private sector council, there is a think tank platform, there is a woman-to-woman platform, there is a youth. So they're all, how they affect the official discourse is another debate. But the important thing is those different streams of the engagement bring a very critical mind, because it is not the African Union, by the way, that decides on who will participate. They leave that the ECOSOC of the African Union, the Economic, Social and Cultural Council. And there's a civil society platform called the CIDO, called the Citizens Directorate, and they then decide who will participate. I think it's very similar, Giovanni, in the context of the joint EU-AU strategy, where they've got there is an NGO component. My sense of that NGO component is one of skepticism. I doubt that they can sort of shape, and because my problem is what comes out of the biennial summits, of the European Union and Union is simply territory diplomacy, void of any real substance. The real substance is really around the sort of hard interest that the European Union has in Africa, particularly around the economic partnership, which is really about embedding free trade agreements, reciprocal trade, free trade agreements in the context of EPAs. That in itself has balkanizing effect, because it is unilateral. The European Union has decided how it would shape regional economic, the regional communities that will participate in the negotiations on the one hand. On the other hand, which countries then be selected in the context of those regional environments sign on to these interim EPAs, which subsequently then become a basis for region-wide. So it's very disempowering at the time, and African countries cannot do without the European Union as far as trade is concerned.
Yeah. In fact, my second question was about this, because so you talked about, for example, the African free trade area, right? Which is, of course, a fantastic achievement. But the problem of many regional organizations in Africa is their effectiveness. So we all know that there is the problem, the so-called spaghetti ball problem in Africa. No, that is the overlapping between regional organizations and so on. So my question was this: that is the European Union helping Africa to helping overcome this problem, or is it aggravating this problem? Because of course, in order to have an effective African free trade area or continental free trade area, we have to solve this problem, of course, right? Sorry, please.
Giovanni, these major steps that have been taken, in Africa's continental integration agenda, there are huge challenges that await. These are both structural and the strategic within the continent. I give a basic example is non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers prevent African countries from trading with each other. 15% of African trade is intra-regional compared to what is it in the EU, something like 60 to 65%, right? So the ambition within the CFTA is to have sort of a progressive but accelerated liberalization and to deal with both tariff and non-tariff barriers over the next 10 to 15 years, which will increase the quantum of intra-regional trade from 15% to 50%, right? The proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We have to see. But I think there is what we call, a community of commitment within the countries that have signed on. The 30 countries exist, and I think it's sort of a good coincidence that the 30 countries are spread that have ratified the instruments of the CFTA. They are spread across regional communities. And what we are looking for in those champions, strategic champions that would make the necessary commitments. The countries like South Africa, like Kenya, like Nigeria, like Ghana, North Africa, Algeria, and Morocco, and then also Egypt. Those who are willing to start the negotiations and make the initial offers. That's on the African side. On the international side, here's an opportunity for all the international partners. Here, I include the United States under a new administration. How can we, sort of reframe our trade and development cooperation frameworks supporting, the essential principles of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, right? So for the European Union, is it possible to have a continent-wide free trade agreement? Do away with the balkanization under EPAS. Get the Commission to think very seriously. We have a continental, got 28 European Union countries. We have an FTA with 55 African countries on the basis of some essential principles that can frame a free trade agreement, under Article 23 of the GATT, which is informed by the experience. The same thing goes with the United States under the preferential regime of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which comes to an end in 2025. What is Biden going to do about this? Can he get the Congress to rethink, trade relations with Africa in the context? So we have to really be aggressive. We have, Africa and the continent, the region's country must really assume greater responsibility and agency. Same thing with China. Recently, as you know, there's the regional the regional comprehensive economic partnership among 15 Asian countries, including China. And the negotiators within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement Secretariat tell China, we want to negotiate with you an FTA on the basis of RCEP. This is the new register of engagement that I think will take Africa and really discipline African countries thinking rather nationally, rather thinking, in continent-wide terms, while also I think that would have, salutary impacts, Giovanni, for improving their own processes of governance. You have to deal with corruption. You can't be corrupt, when you are engaging in these, you need to be very serious about your macroeconomic fundamentals. You really need to be serious about, how can Africa have 41 different currencies when you're negotiating an FTA? It's these sorts of things. 8 of in that arrangement, in Francophone West Africa, etc., etc. So there are possibilities, there are opportunities, but with these come great risks and great challenges, Giovanni. It's a calculus of how you balance the two, but you really need the strategic responsibility and the leadership capacity to take on these challenges. Thanks, Giovanni. May I leave now?
Yeah. Now.
Giovanni, I have to go cycling in 10 minutes. My friends are waiting for me outside.
Cycling, come on, guys. Stay with us for the next few hours. What are you going to do with your friends there? Okay, so thank you very much, Garth.
You know what, Giovanni, one day you'll see me in the Giro, huh?
Yeah, of course. We are waiting for this. Okay, so thank you very much, Garth. Thank you, really, thank you for your lecture, and thank you, dear students, for joining as usual. So please let Garth cycling with his friends, and and keep in touch. Thank you again. Okay.
Giovanni, can I just thank you and Elisa thank you in the first instance for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Elisa, I mean, under these circumstances, I approached this lecture with some trepidation, with acknowledging the theory. But I'm glad it's come off, and thanks to you, and thanks also to your students. I hope they took away some messages and found it interesting. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Elisa is always there helping us. So, yeah.
Bye.
So, thank you. Yeah, bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good ride.
Bye.
Bye.